This talk is entitled Reframing Discussions on Dog Health and Welfare, and we'll also bring in discussions of how responsible breeding and sourcing of dogs relates to this discussion. And by sourcing of dogs, we mean where dogs come from where they're bred and born to how they're distributed to owners. I'm Brenda Bonnett. I would like to thank the organizers for allowing me to virtually talk to you today. Many of you may know me. I'm a Canadian veterinarian and an epidemiologist, but I've been collaborating in Sweden since the mid-1990s with Agria and with Swedish Kennel Club and SLU. I'm currently the CEO of the International Partnership for Dogs, a multi-stakeholder collaborative organization working to bring the dog world together for dog health and welfare and good human-animal interactions. So our goals today are to talk about what veterinarians need to know to really understand current challenges around health and welfare of pedigree dogs and other purpose-bred dogs in Sweden and internationally. And by purpose-bred dogs, we mean, yes, they were bred on purpose, not accidentally, but we also mean that they are bred for a purpose. The next goal is to bring in how responsible breeding and sourcing of dogs enter into the discussion of health and welfare. And then how can you personally engage effectively starting right away? Why is it important to have these discussions now? Well, I think we all understand there's challenges in dog health and welfare, particularly relative to extremes of conformation in dogs, and especially brachycephalics. You all know there was a veterinary petition in Sweden and another in the UK demanding change. Recently, there are many new legislative moves, sometimes about enforcement of existing legislation in the Netherlands and Finland. And some of these are quite controversial, and some of them quite far-ranging. I'll be providing a PDF file that can be downloaded that will have lots of links and references to papers and reports relative to my talk. Unfortunately, some of things like petitions and legislations lead to confrontation rather than collaboration. People feel threatened in different groups. And we've all seen this outrage culture on social media that sometimes degenerates into personal attacks. The concern is that people on social media may get the most notice, but they may not reflect the majority. So we're on a bit of a slippery slope. It's possible for far-reaching consequences from things like legislations where we're restricting brachycephalics today, and then animal rights groups find a toehold to go and restrict small dogs and then big dogs, and then who knows. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do see that there is a possible for broader impacts of narrow legislation. So we'd like to promote collective and collaborative efforts for common goals with open, respectful dialogue, perhaps based more on evidence and understanding and a little less on emotion, although we may need to understand where that emotion comes from and how it impacts discussions. We need to define our terms, so we're going to talk about dog health and welfare, and you can't do that without including talking about people and human-animal interactions. So I'd like to say a little bit about what we say versus what we mean, and I'm going to start with some very simple definitions. So for the sake of this talk, please just accept these as they are. So we might say that health is an absence of disease, that welfare is the absence of pain and suffering, and if we're wanting to support good human-animal interactions, that's the human-animal bond, but also everything else people and dogs do together and how animals enrich our lives and our society. So the big picture. And then how does that relate to what we mean? Well, do we really mean a total absence of disease? Or maybe we mean an absence of preventable disease, or really just an acceptable level of disease. And then if we're talking about the level of disease, are we talking about the rate, the number of animals experiencing event out of the whole population during a period of time, or risk? How likely it is that an animal, a dog of a specific breed, will get a condition compared to other breeds. And these things vary. And we get into problems if we try to generalize or create simple rules across diseases or breeds. We have to be able to individualize to specific situations. And then if for welfare, again, we're probably not talking a total perfect world where there's absolutely no pain and suffering. I don't have that in my world. But there's an adequate or acceptable level of welfare. And that's not black and white, even in terms of the extent to which we go to treat an individual animal. It's quite personal. It's different in different parts of the world. If we focus now on supporting good human-animal interactions, of course, this is where people and pets interact. And most of us would believe that there's some good balance between what people want, what they like in a dog, in its appearance or otherwise, what their hobbies or goals are, and the needs or requirements, quality of life, welfare, and health of the dog. There's some kind of balance. But very often that balance gets tipped and unfortunately frequently tipped towards people away from dogs. But understanding the complexity of these relationships is important as we try and find solutions to problems. One current example we're looking at is pandemic puppies, where in 2020 people stuck at home, maybe after years of saying they couldn't or wouldn't or shouldn't get a dog, they want one. Maybe the children are driving them crazy, so they want to distract the children. This has been a worldwide phenomenon with an unbelievable increase in the demand for dogs, which makes us wonder where are they being supplied from, because the best breeders can't instantly produce hundreds more puppies. So there's probably more people breeding and possibly more dogs from larger sources. We worry that the prices have become phenomenal. There's scams. We worry about long-term consequences of whether these dogs will stay in these homes when everybody goes back to work or whether there'll be relinquishment problems. But again, it's the people's desires are driving this with perhaps less concern for dogs. Another concerning issue is when people are buying dogs for status, and this is very often a problem with extreme dogs. So we have Tibetan Mastiffs becoming super popular in China, dogs as status symbols being bought for up to $2 million. The bigger the better, weird colors if possible. And as it says in this article, this can't end well. Even if it ends okay for the $2 million dog, there's real concerns about breeds, other breeds, popularity, people buying dogs as status symbols as opposed to for the dogs themselves or that they really fit in their life. So, do you think there's anything about status going on here? This is a dog show, obviously, the anonymized dog winning it. And I think if we think about dog shows, it's a little bit more about the people and what they want and their culture and their hobby or their lifestyle than the dogs. Not to say there aren't lots of dogs that enjoy going to dog shows and being in exhibitions, but we still have to think maybe it's leaning a little bit towards what people want. Of course, originally dog shows were about selecting the best stock, creating and maintaining breeds, And nowadays it can be hard for us to look at this French Bulldog and this one and think that this really was seen as an improvement in the overall health or function of the breed as a whole. And I think we have to appreciate that it's probably more based on aesthetic values or what people want rather than what might be best for the dog. But we have to remember that in many countries, it's seen as, hey, it's what people do. People make decisions, people want what they want, and they can have it. And so it's a real challenge internationally to come up with collective actions. This is a new paper, a relatively new paper, looking at the facial morphology of brachycephalic breeds. A group in France got photographs in profile of champion-winning dogs over the last at least 100 years in these 3 breeds. We hope to see reports on other breeds as well. And the idea was to look at whether there has been a change in the craniofacial ratio during that time. Many people say, oh, the dogs are the same as they were 100 years ago and they haven't changed. Other people disagree with that. So this was a good approach to look at this. The craniofacial ratio measurement of the length of the muzzle to the length of the skull is designed to be done on live dogs, obviously, but this was probably a reasonable approach to try and look at in photographs, and they did fairly good methodology or tried to do this. And I think I recommend that you read it. It's not a long article, and it's very interesting, and I hope that we see more. For the Bulldog, they found that even back in late 1800s, early 1900s, the craniofacial ratio was around the 0.3 mark, and it got even smaller, shorter muzzles in the 50s to the 80s, and since then recovered a little bit. So just this graphical presentation brings evidence to the discussion of what's changed or how, and maybe there's some hope that these kinds of changes can happen. And of course, like much of the work we see, it highlights breed differences. They also present the pug, mops, Carlin. And that line is pretty straight downwards. Even if there is a bit of variation, there's a fairly marked change in the length of the muzzle over 140 years. So certainly breeds are changing, and we have to constantly be aware of, is it for the better or the worse in terms of function or any kind of characteristics that could affect health and welfare. So it's worth thinking that these are purpose-bred dogs, but purposes may change over time. It may be that breeds that still are used for their original purpose, hunting or herding or protection, are still bred mainly with a focus on fitness. But we know that many breeds are really primarily companion animals now, and they do not work or have a specific function. And then if the focus is on appearance and what people like about appearance, or this that we just talked about, status, then we have a concern. They are breeding for that purpose, but it's that who decides what's okay. And so when smaller and smaller becomes attractive, any kind of extreme becomes attractive, there is the potential for an impact on health and welfare. I include this picture. This is someone breeding FCI registered French Bulldogs, so taking from registered dogs, but looking for dogs with a greater craniofacial ratio and more fit, and being absolutely transparent about their health status, this Hawbuck's kennel in the Netherlands. And so they are at least an example that maybe there are changes that can be made. Unfortunately, they are not being welcomed by many of their French Bulldog colleagues. Another situation we should talk about is the purposes for dogs includes the military and protection. And you might remember a story about Diesel, a dog with the French military who at the time of the Bataclan disaster bombings was sent into an apartment to see if there were still terrorists there, and there were, and the dog was killed. And the dog was hailed as being very brave. I think we really have to admit that that dog was not being brave, that dog was being obedient. And that's definitely a purpose and a use that's more on the side of the people than the dog, even if an individual working dog enjoys working. So there's just many examples of this balance in human-animal interactions. So here we have this complexity of the roles and rights of people, the rights and needs and roles of dogs, very different across different countries, and I would say different across people within countries. So who gets to decide what's okay and not okay in terms of rates or risks of disease? What's adequate welfare? Is it okay if people choose to focus on their own desires? Well, really, it's all stakeholders have an input, legislators, society, the individual, experts, but maybe not everybody agrees on the final decisions. I'd like to go on now and provide some examples and comparisons of the use of risk and rate using data from the Agria Breed Profiles from 2011 to 2016. Here's a graphing of the rate of one or more veterinary care events for corneal ulcers for pugs, French bulldogs, Boston Terriers, and including some comparisons of Bichon Frise, Cairn Terrier, and all breeds. And on the lower axis, we have the number of incidents, at least one veterinary care event per 10,000 dog years at risk. And then you can see that the pug and the French bulldog have much higher rates than do all breeds. And then we've calculated the relative risk, which is the rate in the breed compared to the rate in all breeds. And then we see that the pug has 13 times increased risk of at least one veterinary care event for a corneal ulcer in the 6 years compared to all breeds. You can see that Bichon Frises, Cairn Terriers, and all breeds at the bottom have approximately the same rate. And so you could say those breeds are getting corneal ulcers because they're dogs, not because they have a higher breed risk. So we see that pugs and French bulldogs have an increased risk compared to all breeds. But if we calculate the actual percentage of all the dogs that this happened to, we can say that approximately a third of pugs and a quarter of French bulldogs experienced at least one corneal ulcer in 6 years period of time. So it's not 100%, but most of us as veterinarians would think those were still pretty high numbers. This chart is for malformations and developmental abnormalities for the upper respiratory tract, and on the top is life insurance or death, and below is veterinary care for French bulldogs compared to all breeds. And the rate in French bulldogs is higher for both life claims and veterinary care claims. And French bulldogs are 50 times more likely to die of this condition, 20 times more likely to have a veterinary care event. This is mainly congenital in young animals. But those high risks represent only about 2.5% of French bulldogs experiencing veterinary care events. And so you will know as a veterinarian that perhaps this doesn't reflect all conditions because they can be underreported in insurance data. But I can tell you that in the insurance data and in data from VetCompass in the UK, the recorded rates of conditions are not that dissimilar when we look at breathing problems in general, depending on how that's defined. The Vet Compass data, for example, found it occurring in under 15% of certain brachycephalic breeds. And it doesn't really matter at this point about the exact numbers if you still say, but the risk is that much higher. It's clearly a breed-specific problem, but it becomes a problem in communication with breeders and others if we don't have fully accurate data. But we know that in some of these conditions, the UK vets, for example, told me that they didn't record all dogs that had breathing problems because the owners thought it was normal for the breed, and if they weren't treating, they just didn't record it. And so when this happens, we see how this can contribute to challenges when we're talking about brachycephalics. So there could be some in the dog show world, so breeders, judges maybe, and they say they're okay, they're all okay, by which they mean most of them are okay. They have an okay life and they're healthy enough. And some veterinarians join the conversation and say, no, they're all sick. All those dogs are sick or compromised. And so we get extremes of language, even about the extremes in the dogs. And I think it's important to look at why we're seeing such differences, maybe even looking at the same data. And that can be because of perspective. How much is too much? Are we talking about rate or risk? What are the clinical signs that we're saying are important, or how important are they? And then, of course, the person's history, their personal attitude, and their own personal agendas come to play in interpreting perhaps the facts. The other difference can arise because of different populations. Presumably, the worst affected dogs don't end up in dog shows. They don't end up winning in the dog show ring. At least we hope that really badly affected dogs never make it that far. So maybe when the judges say, the dogs I see are healthy, maybe, at least compared to what veterinarians see. Veterinarians see the worst of the worst. And so we run into this situation where sometimes the confrontation arises even when we have evidence. But we have to have good dialogue to understand each other, but then we need even better data to help define the situation. So when we ask the question, who decides? There are some data we can look at. These are American Kennel Club registrations for French Bulldogs. You can see a logarithmic increase in the number of dogs registered from 1970 to 2017. Certainly, at least since 2008, there have been a lot of educational programs trying to dissuade people from owning dogs of this breed and other brachycephalics because of health and welfare programs, but obviously the consumers have decided they want these dogs. Some of the material has been consistent across Sweden, Finland, and the UK, that the median age at death for all causes for French Bulldogs is less than 5 years of age. And still, recent papers from England, Rowena Packer's group, 2019 and 2020, continue to show us that owners underplay or do not recognize that their dogs are sick. They excuse their health condition as normal for the breed. And surprisingly, even when they've owned a sick dog that's perhaps been expensive for veterinary care and even heartbreaking, they plan to get another one, something like 92% in her recent paper. And this pug is a picture I took in a park in Chicago, and this dog is compromised obviously not only by its breed and its conformation, by its owners not realizing that allowing a dog, any dog, but especially a dog of this breed, to be this obese poses not only health problems but welfare problems. So we have challenges to get through to owners on their decision making, because in the end they are making so many of these decisions. These are complex problems. That's the situation. They're complex. Many stakeholders' attitudes come into it, human-animal interactions, issues of health and disease. And are we looking for simple solutions? That's the problem. If we think one law or one legislation or one approach is going to work for all breeds and all situations and all owners, it's probably wishful thinking. And so we have to learn to embrace the real situation. So who are all these stakeholders? Even if we believe that almost everybody who has anything to do with dogs would say, yes, I think dog health and welfare are important. How does that look across stakeholder groups? Well, we have kennel and breed clubs that, especially in the Nordic countries, are doing a lot to define health and welfare. Then we have wider producers and distributors of dogs, and maybe it's not quite as much in Sweden as in other countries yet, but I'll show you a little bit of data in a minute. You probably are getting imports. People are going outside of Sweden, or dogs are becoming available from other than typical sources. And certainly in other parts of the world, it accounts for the majority of dogs coming from commercial breeders, etc. We have legislators and regulators. And of course, the public and individual consumers have a huge impact. Researchers, veterinarians, the academic world, and veterinary organizations have a role to play. They're stakeholders, as is the pet industry. And we have the welfare sector, which may be mostly shelters, online services, rescues, and then we get into situations of trying to decide what are bona fide rescues or people just jumping on the demand to supply dogs. Even if all of these groups would say they care about dog health and welfare, the way they define the dog health and welfare and their priorities may be quite different. Sweden has also been proactive in bringing multiple stakeholder groups together for discussion of these issues. And Åke Hedhammer, who I'm sure you all know, is having a virtual booth at this conference to present material on one of these efforts, and I encourage you to check it out. Approaches. The International Partnership for Dogs, our organization has these international dog health workshops. We work a lot on bringing people together from all stakeholder groups. We've written a recent article on reframing discussions, and I hope if you have any interest in this talk, you'll go ahead and read it. And I just want to say talking is great, but there has to also be doing. If we come back to this chart of stakeholders, it's good to talk about responsibility. And of course, we want responsible breeders to produce healthy dogs with good welfare. But it's not just about the production, it's also about the distribution. What happens in sales, transport? How does it get to the consumer, to the owner? And it's not just that breed and kennel club associated breeders are all super responsible, or that they are the only responsible breeders. There's some good programs being developed to improve health and welfare from smaller commercial breeding units in the United States. And again, we have to tackle online traffic and distribution as well. And then over on the public side, of course, they have a responsibility to understand how to go about acquiring a dog, although we kind of know that our efforts at educating on that front sometimes go awry as well. But all stakeholders in this chart have something to do with almost every other part of the chart, either informing it or creating data or communicating or educating. It's not as simple as saying, let's just have responsible dog breeding and everything will be fine. Probably responsible ownership is happening quite well in Sweden and Finland. You have great societal values for animal welfare. People understand responsible pet ownership and see that it is enforced. Historically, the countries have a high proportion of registered pedigree dogs and oversight of breeding, excellent access to veterinary care, and high rates of insurance coverage. All of those things are good. It may also relate possibly to lower proportion of households with dogs compared to the United States, for example, and maybe people who simply cannot provide an adequate, responsible level of care do not get pets. And I assure you that's not the same in every country. Responsible breeding is also happening here. Both the Swedish and Finnish kennel clubs are visionary. They've been active and proactive for many years. They also provide excellent tools linking pedigree and health data so that their breed clubs can do the work of defining health strategies and following them. And the Agria stats have contributed to that, so that a lot of this work is quite evidence-based. But again, this is not happening everywhere in the world. On the other hand, you have a Swedish law that says do not use in breeding any dogs exhibiting clinical signs of disease. Well, that seems pretty straightforward, but I think the enforcement is very difficult on this. The language is, as I have seen it, leaves room for interpretation, and so we back into this problem of perhaps how the breeders or breed clubs see it versus how the veterinarians see it. And of course, depending on how strictly defined clinical signs are, well, there may be no absolutely perfectly healthy dogs or not enough of a breed to make a difference. So again, we need to think about the clinician's responsibility in defining clinical signs, being absolutely certain that owners know, whether it's pleasant or not to hear it, that their dog, even if it's got a condition common in their breed, that condition is not necessarily normal. It's the only way we're going to advance that people understand this meaning of clinical signs and health problems rather than just breed characteristics. As I described earlier when I spoke at the London Veterinary Show about statistics, if these are not recorded in records, then if these conditions are not recorded in medical records, they won't be reflected in data collection. So it's another responsibility of veterinarians to contribute accurate data. There's a listing in the PDF for an Australian paper by Fawcett and McGreevy and others, and it really does a good job of describing the challenges, ethical, business, and otherwise, for veterinarians in these areas, and I would recommend it to you. So it is acknowledged it's a tough situation to be in, but hey, life is hard. And I just want to say here, when we discuss these differences of opinions about laws or regulations or situations, do we have all the right people at the table? Because if we're going to understand other people's perspectives, we probably have to hear it from them, not just to imagine what they think. And also, even when we're discussing problems of extreme conformation, we need to have at the table people who really understand about breeds without extremes. Some of those breeds might head in that direction eventually, but it's very important to get the mass of the middle ground of people to speak up and be part of these discussions, especially if we have to really take some hard decisions with a few breeds. We need to hear from the majority of breeds if they understand that tough actions have to be taken. So if we go back to our table of stakeholders, we need to discuss a couple more things. We have the supply side, and many of the discussions have been focused on this side, and especially focused on kennel and breed clubs saying you have to produce healthy dogs. No argument there. But we have the demand side, and the demand in almost every country outstrips what is being produced by responsible kennel club breeders. Now there's a wide variety of breeders along the spectrum, but there are many, in some countries, as much as 80 to 90% of dogs in a year are coming from sources other than breed clubs associated with a kennel club. And so when the demand is high, the response by producers may come more from commercial breeders than, say, pedigree breeders or kennel club breeders. We've looked at some of the stats in some of the countries, and at the dog health workshop, I raised the concept that if you could get rid of every puppy mill and every commercial breeder and every bad rescue and every bad source of dogs tomorrow, and all illegal trade and all transport from other countries or mass transport from other countries, would you be willing to do it if you had to explain to the public that, depending on your country, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80% of the people who want a puppy aren't getting one this year because we only want them supplied from the best breeders? Does the pet industry want to look at a way reduced number of pet-owning households? This increase in pet ownership, this increase in the supply side coming from questionable sources, is a direct consequence of us, the veterinarian pet industry, saying everybody should have a pet because they're great for human-animal interactions and people will feel better. So it's just a situation to talk about the supply side separate from the demand side will not lead us to making the best decisions on effective solutions. And then if we roll into 2020, we have this situation where the demand went crazy. People wanted a dog when they wanted a dog, and the supply could not keep up with the demand. Prices went crazy. Probably people's thoughts on what was the right way to go about getting a dog went out the window, and we have this situation where we now have longer term concerns for the dogs. And again, think about, where did that supply come from? I was asked if I could provide information on imported dogs, and I have no data on that. What I've calculated here is from the Agria data from 2011 to 2016, and it's a rate of one or more veterinary care events per 10,000 years at risk in registered and non-registered dogs, with the orange or red bars being the rate of one or more veterinary care events in registered dogs, and the gray or black bars being the rate in unregistered dogs. The line with the yellow stars is the percent of registered dogs in a breed. And you can see by this that, in fact, the rate of veterinary care events is higher for registered dogs than unregistered, possibly imported dogs, in all breeds except English Bulldogs at the very far right, where the unregistered dogs have a slightly higher rate of disease. You can see at the right-hand side of the graph that Amstaffs and French Bulldogs and English Bulldogs have both very high rates of veterinary care events and relatively low percentages of registered dogs. So between about 50 and 70% of dogs of those breeds are registered, and they have high rates of disease. But if you look over at the far left side of the graph, Chihuahuas, Papillons, Yorkshire Terriers, and Shih Tzus also have lower than average percent registered, with Shih Tzus the lowest at about 50% registered, but they do not have particularly high rates of veterinary care events, and they still have a higher, slightly higher rate of veterinary care events in registered dogs compared to unregistered dogs. So nothing there to prove anything about imports, but also nothing to suggest that all the diseases in these, all the biggest problems in these breeds are being produced in unregistered or imported dogs. Can we achieve some sort of convergence? We have producers and sources on the supply side and consumers on the demand side, and then perhaps stewards are the kennel clubs and the breed clubs and the veterinarians and other contributors. And yes, I hope we can work together to find a way to make good decisions for dog health and welfare that also keeps people happy as we move forward. So we have all these stakeholders. And again, I want to remind you that this is individuals and organizations. There's lots of overlap. Many stakeholders wear more than one hat. When I was at a veterinary meeting in Copenhagen in 2017 and a veterinary meeting about problems in brachycephalics, 150 to 200 veterinary professionals in the room, nurses, vets, etc. They were complaining about what was wrong with consumers, that they kept buying these dogs and they kept having these dogs and they were so sick and it was such a problem. And towards the end, I asked them to raise their hand as to whether how many of them knew a veterinarian or veterinary professional who owned a brachycephalic dog. And at least 80% of the 150, 200 people raised their hand. Then I asked them, how many of you know a veterinary professional who breeds brachycephalic dogs? And at least 25 of them put up their hands. And so I think we have to realize that it isn't just consumers that are attracted by these dogs and committed to these dogs, and that it's not just an easy thing to say, oh, if they only understood they were sick, everything would be okay. There's diversity within and across stakeholder groups. Then we see that even within the veterinary profession, there's not one voice on this. So everybody's attitudes, history, beliefs, etc. comes to play, as does their willingness to accept change. And so we have to understand that it's not just a straightforward way, and we all have a role to play. I'm only going to briefly go through some of this information. Together with my colleagues at IPFD, we are trying to create a roadmap document that would make suggestions on activities for individuals in any stakeholder group, and then the groups themselves to examine where they are and how they might contribute to respectful discussions and collaborative efforts. Right now, I'll just focus quickly on a couple of items for veterinary professionals. Personally, so how about some self-examination? What contributions have you personally made for improvement of dog health and welfare in this context of breed-specific problems? Is there more that you could do in terms of respectful dialogue, discussions, bringing people in that should be part of the discussion? Have you learned about the perspectives and challenges of other stakeholders, and if they view things differently, why? And is it just a matter of perspective, or they might be looking at different populations to inform discussions and make them more respectful? Are you satisfied with the way things are, or do you want to be part of meaningful change? We can't just wait for our organizations to fix everything. It's about personal action first, and then that should create a tidal wave of action out of that. Ethically, I think it's important for people to decide what their ethical boundaries are, what's okay and not okay, when you're juggling business interests with the client's personal interests and the dog's interest, it's not easy. But you have to have some kind of line where you say, okay, this far and no farther. So what's your personal tipping point? We might all want to look at quick wins. What can you do tomorrow morning? And we've talked about a couple things, and I'll come back to them. Very briefly, if we talk about responsibilities from the research, scientific, and veterinary community, obviously we have a role in bringing data and evidence to the issue. And so that includes recording in our medical records if we think a problem, if a characteristic of a dog is a health problem, it should be recorded even if you're not going to treat it or do surgery on it. And this may need to be explained to the owner in a sensitive way, but we have to build better evidence on these issues. Of course, sometimes there can be a gap between the academic view and items that can be put into action. And so we have to be sensitive to this bigger picture view and understand how things fit together. We understand that it's difficult to talk to clients about obesity or breed-specific problems that they may or may not be able to do anything about, or to tell them their dog has a welfare problem. But it's up to veterinarians to tackle with owners this normal for the breed concept. It is probably one of the most dangerous and pervasive concepts out there that leads to these misperceptions. So as veterinarians, we need to be really proactive role models in good behavior. As I've said, I don't have time to go into all these other processes, but I hope you will access our information in the PDF and online at DogWellNet on a roadmap for the future that asks the pet industry, veterinarians, researchers, everybody to examine their own role. It's also important to remember that dog health and welfare occurs at all levels of organization, from the local to the global. There are many things similar and different within and across these levels of organization, but the best results will come from being informed and inclusive of processes across these levels. Unilateral country level efforts to make laws that then may impact other regions, not so good, and not good if they haven't included all the appropriate stakeholders. So it's good to think about the role of legislation and regulation, and it's very understandable why we've got to this point. And as attractive as it might be to think, okay, great, we're going to set some rules, I don't think that legislation and regulation is the way forward for effective change. Even if we all say we're going for dog health and welfare and good human-animal interactions, it's probably too complex to be handled by simple legislation and regulation. And it's very important that we watch out for unintended consequences, where even we might embrace legislation that will impact a certain breed or a couple of breeds, and we might think that's appropriate. We need to think, what are the longer term consequences if this type of approach starts to be applied more broadly to other breeds, dog populations, dog ownership in general. The take-home messages I want you to go away with include that this is obviously complex. People, dogs, health, welfare, human-animal interactions. We've got to look at the big picture, and there's many inputs. This can't be done by any one stakeholder group or by one stakeholder group figuring out the problem and telling everybody what to do. It needs to be at least collective actions, if not truly collaborative, if we're going to come up with effective solutions. Supply and demand, there's two sides to this equation, and we have to look at both of them. And we must get through to consumers. As long as the consumers provide the demand, somebody's going to supply it. We have tried to educate. We need to look at new tools that support human behavior change, and we need to find creative ways to make a difference. Of course, it's all about you. What can you do? Where can you have the best input? And I can't promote strongly enough the idea about respectful dialogue. Screaming on Facebook, personal attacks is not going to bring us to collective actions for our common goals. So we need to find good ways to communicate. That is how change happens. One gesture, one person, one moment at a time. I think that that's a positive way to think as we move forward. Thank you for your attention. I think we're going to have some questions now. And in the meantime, tack så mycket.